So my paper is We the Border, Biometric Rebordering Practices as Global Governance. This is adjacent to my MA thesis, which discusses US military use of biometrics in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I started this paper by asking, how do states use biometric technology as a bordering mechanism? I find biometrics are used as a rebordering practice by states in an increasingly globalized world to secure the movements of citizens and non-citizens within and outside physical and ideological sovereign territory. I argue that through states' use of biometrics, the border is redrawn on the bodies of those who do move, have moved, or may one day move within and in relation to state territory. This rebordering occurs both domestically and supranationally, where practices of categorization abroad affect domestic outcomes and vice versa. So to kind of define biometric technology, I draw heavily on Shoshana Magnet's book, When Biometrics Fail. It's pretty good. You should give it a read. The term biometrics itself is broad and refers to multiple physiological and behavioral characteristics, which most of us have in some capacity, but which are either unique to us, such as our fingerprints or our DNA, or have some form of ordering function, which allows for the distinction of some people from other people. So for example, face shape and gender. Biometrics are used for both identification that the individual exists and verification that the individual is who they say they are. Biometric databases such as the US military's Automated Biometric Information System, or ABIS, are able to aggregate this data, share it, and analyze it against other forms of identification or additional identifying details. Readability of an individual has to do with how well their data can be analyzed by the database. So due to a push from the private sector who wanted to convince governments of the efficacy of biometrics to land government contracts, the prevailing discourse is that biometrics are objective and almost completely secure measures of identity. We can talk about the failures and also the racist, sexist, ableist, ageist groundings of biometrics in the questions if you want. I just don't have time here. So to the theory and methods, my work is grounded in studies of neoliberalism and globalization and international relations, but for context, I'm just going to review two things, the concept of the surveillance assemblage, and then I'm going to have a quick discussion on borders. So I am using Haggerty and Erickson's surveillance assemblage, which consists of discrete flows of an essentially limitless range of phenomena, such as people, science, chemicals, knowledge, and institutions. This assemblage employs data, including biometric data, to create data doubles, which mark access to resources, services, and power, and which are targeted for intervention by governments and companies. The surveillance assemblage allows for the expression of surveillance as a key component of modern institutions, including US military biometric databases. So insights from the literature on borders will be used to position the border as both flexible and imagined, and increasingly located at and within the body. For example, Vogt views the border as arterial, so like arteries, not located at the physical border, but stretching out from the border across the country. Further, these borders are malleable and change in response to the actions of, in Vogt's case, migrants, who are then countered by actions of law enforcement and other agents, such as government agents, criminal gangs, safe houses, and locales. Vogt's concepts of the arterial border, which she applies to her research in Mexico, is used to show the increasingly mobile and adaptable nature of the state bordering practices and resistance to them. The idea from authors such as Lyon, Petit, and Graham that surveillance and war and governance can be everywhere locates the border on our bodies, highlighting that the only way the border can be everywhere is if we are the border. Interestingly, authors Parker and Adler-Nissen go against the idea that globalization means a loss of state borders to focus instead on how states participate in bordering. And it is in this same vein that biometrics is examined here as a practice of rebordering. Okay, so I'm going to move on to discussing the US-Canada biometric matrix. So companies providing biometric technology in 2000 were eager to promote their services early, affirming their products were security enhancing and in fact one of the only technologies which could truly keep citizens safe after 9/11. So biometric identification systems were quickly incorporated at US and Canadian airports. Established in order to collect information from Iraqi and Afghan citizens during interventions there, ABIS, which I talked about earlier, is connected to the FBI databases and is used collaboratively with the DHS. Due to the post 9/11 information sharing protocols, parts of these databases are also shared with at least the Canadian Border Services Agency and some branches within NATO. As of 2011, 1 in 14 Iraqi citizens and 1 in 20 Afghan citizens were registered in ABIS, with far higher rates of registration for men than for women. Registrations are often officially said to only occur when a prisoner or someone else is detained and when locals applied for government jobs, but in reality, whole towns are often added to the database, including civilians and children. This collection of data continued into 2012 as Canada's Temporary Resident Biometrics Project was created in order to protect Canada from unwanted individuals who, it was said, exploited the weak identification systems in place at the time. In 2018, Canada proposed further expansions at the border through biometrics, including the creation of risk-based immigration lanes, expansions of travel lists from the early 2000s, and a more concerted effort to collect fingerprints of foreign nationals. As the US continues to share information with domestic and international agencies, Canada's TRBP operates in visa application centers around the world, managed by third parties who send fingerprints and facial scans to the RCMP for comparison with criminal records, with established data sharing with the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, so like the Five Eyes. With supposedly robust information collection, analysis, and sharing in place, biometric rebordering holds the promise that the state using it can never be vulnerable again, as the information is collected and cross-referenced far before risky individuals ever reach the physical border. So to talk about insecurity in rebordering, biometrics is used as a quicker, more reliable version of information than a traveler's story, negating the ability for the traveler to accommodate and advocate for themselves. It is in this way that biometrics become inscribed on the body as the border. At once, a separate data double is manipulated independently from the individual, and at once, this is deeply tied to the physical realities of the individual, such as the opportunities and consequences faced by them at the border. Biometric bordering is inherently hierarchical. While most Western passport holders will travel giving biometrics here and there to immigration officials, many don't think about that. They don't think of themselves as a biometric border, but as a traveler. Those with more precarious identities must negotiate the border and their data in an entirely different way. Countries from where biometric data is needed for the TBRP are defined based on past risky applicants and current situations in those countries. So for example, most Middle East, North African countries, as well as some sub-Saharan African, Asian, and South American countries are where the collection of biometrics from foreign nationals is centered. So not Europe. So those who might not know their data is being collected or do not know for what purposes face further precarity. In Iraq and Afghanistan, where the US collects its data for ABIS, they collect primarily from rural communities where there are numerous barriers to informed consent. No US military documents detail explaining what biometric information will be used or for how long it will be retained. No explanation at all to the people it's being collected from. But the information is used and continues to be used to test biometrics against fingerprints found in the context of terrorist activity and is being used to conduct lethal strikes on suspected combatants. So information is gathered on the ground by US and allied troops and used by US and allied troops, including Canadian and other NATO troops. Personal and biometric data collected by Canada abroad through the TBRP and at the Canadian border is also shared with the US and other partners. In the questions, I can also talk about how this use reveals the racist imperial duality of the complex us and the simplified them, but again, I don't have time here. The precarity of individuals and their vulnerability in the face of biometric rebordering is determined in part by how readable, as I mentioned before, they are. Individuals assumed to be more at risk and therefore put at risk of further detention if their data is unreadable. But readability is not always associated with guilt or evasion because work conditions, ethnicity, gender, age, and ability can all contribute to the readability of your biometrics. So in conclusion, state management of identity is not only domestic, the management of identity is the management of the border against threats produced in a globalized and insecure world. States no longer seek to classify only their citizens, and borders are no longer a line in the sand between inside and outside. Citizens are classified not just as citizens, but as a certain type of citizen. Further, non-citizens too are classified and specifically classified with reference to how they have, will, or might act in relation to the state as both territorial and ideological entity. Fear of migrant bodies in Canada and the US by the state is representative of a fear of losing sovereignty. Therefore, states must control the bodies and flow of travelers through placing the border at the body with biometrics, keeping physical bodies of the most risky as far away from the territorial border as possible for as long as possible until they are deemed safe enough to enter by creating the border at the site of the body. So of course I have more to say, but I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you so much for this opportunity and thank you for listening. I know this contained a lot of difficult language, so I'm really sorry if it was too condensed, but that's it from me.